Since the conception of the United States, racial injustice and brutality against Black people has been prevalent throughout the country's history. From slavery to segregation to the Black Lives Matter movement, it is an issue ingrained in the nation's very soil. Yet, despite the ever-present injustice, many victims of such violence are often forgotten, far more than are remembered. Even the most brutal and significant of instances are brushed under the rug. Which brings us to Robert Charles. Charles, a Black man, who was born just after the abolishment of slavery, who lived and suffered through the rise of America's next violent period of Black oppression, the Jim Crow era. Charles, a hero who stood up to racial profiling and police brutality in 1900s New Orleans. Charles, a murderer who killed 27 people in self-defense, who was ultimately lynched and dragged through the streets at the hands of a white mob. Though his story is mostly lost to time, we've attempted to excavate it the best we can. Who was Robert Charles exactly? Just what precisely occurred that forced Charles's hand, that incited a riot that lasted for nearly a week? And why is this information so difficult to find? In this 7-part mini docuseries, we hope to inform, analyze, and interpret, ultimately revealing that which has been lost. Who was Robert Charles? Robert Charles was born around late 1865 to Jasper and Mariah Charles in Copiah County, Mississippi. The Charles family, all 11 to be exact, lived in a small building on the outskirts of the land as sharecroppers on a cotton plantation along Bayou Pierre. The most definitive thing that historians can say about the Charleses is that they were landless sharecroppers who were poor, but not any worse off than any other Black family living in Pine Bluff. At 14, Robert was literate, but he was no longer attending school. He was given the occupation of laborer in most documentation. At 17, Robert and his family were witnesses to the Democratic March through various counties, a march that often turned violent. None of the records of that time indicate that anyone in the Charles family were victims of such violence or ever testified in regard to the march, but researchers assume they did make efforts to hide from the mob, like most other Black people in Copiah County. In 1887, Robert, now 21 years old, left Copiah County to work in Vicksburg. He was now 30 miles away from his parents in Pine Bluff. Historians believe the hope of a sizable payday working to excavate trenches for water pipes is what drew him to Vicksburg. During this time, Robert was described as a big man, over 6 feet tall and weighing no less than 190 pounds. In 1888, Robert found steady employment with the Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas Railroad. He was a second hand until May 1892, when he was entangled in a situation with a flagman. In 1890, his older brother Henry joined him, and they worked together. In the majority of records we can find today, Robert Charles was never really mentioned in print and had no troubles with the authorities in Vicksburg. He was, however, listed in the Warren County tax rolls as living in the railroad shops. With these clues, most can say that Robert was quiet and kept his head down. At some point during his residence in Vicksburg, he did purchase a pistol, most likely a Colt .44. We can assume that there were a few reasons that Robert felt the need for a weapon, one of which was the amount of lynchings and other racial tensions rife throughout the area. There was also a pack of half-wild dogs that ran in the city at all times, threatening life and limb. On May 23, 1892, 2 years after Robert's brother had joined him, the two men were doing routine maintenance on a local section of track in the town of Rolling Fork. Both men were armed. The next part is unclear as to the whys and hows, but it was said that a teenager in the area had stolen one of their pistols a few days prior and hid it on the train when they were being transported to Vicksburg. They found the teen and ordered him to give the pistol back, but he said that the flagman had it. The white flagman stepped out, the pistol drawn. That's when Robert and Henry both began being shot at. Both parties ran for cover as the flagman was firing, and the brothers began to return fire. As the train pulled away and gained more speed, the flagman threw the gun from the side. The brothers retrieved the gun and ran for cover in a nearby swamp. No one was hurt and no arrests were made. However, that was the moment that Robert became a wanted man. Because of the commotion in Rolling Fork, it also made his living in Vicksburg and working for the railroad track near impossible. So Charles left and lived under a new alias, Curtis Robertson. The next time Charles appears in history, he is using his alias as Curtis, and it is 1994, 2 years later. In this record, it is a legal matter in Copiah County. Robert was arrested for selling alcohol in a dry county. He pleaded guilty but served no jail time. Many believe he was a sweet talker with both black people and white people alike, so the judge let him off easy. He was released to attempt to raise money for the $50 fine he received. Robert then eventually became a wanted man in 1895, as he never did repay those funds. He left Copiah in 1894 and settled in New Orleans. Robert briefly returned to Copiah in 1896 to amend his statement to the court, changing his plea to not guilty. This nullified the warrant. In 1896, after the new verdict, Robert returned to New Orleans and joined the International Migration Society, a group that transported American black people back to Africa. Charles then put his first payment down towards his trip to Liberia. The remaining 4 years that Robert Charles remained in New Orleans and helping the Migration Society are hazy and not well documented. What is known does shed some light on Charles' character and how he was perceived by others. Many said he was a literate and charismatic man, one well-versed in smooth-talking individuals to get what he needed. He was a hard worker, too, and only after the events of 1900 did people's opinion of him take a turn. The facts of the situation. In New Orleans, in the late afternoon of July 23, 1900, Robert Charles and his roommate Leonard Pierce sat on a porch in a neighborhood other than their own. 3 white police officers, Sergeant Jules C. Aucoin, August T. Mora, and Joseph D. Cantrell, were told to check on suspicious activity in the area and approached the 2 men at the porch. The officers began questioning them until the encounter turned confrontational. When Charles stood to face his interrogators, the officers viewed the gesture as a threat and began to beat Charles and Pierce. Officer Mora hit Charles over the head with his baton repeatedly. Charles drew his gun in self-defense, to which Mora responded by drawing his own. Both fired and sustained injury, with Charles running from the scene and Mora downed from a shot to the hip. Pierce was arrested on site. The next morning, on July 24th, 2 policemen, Officer Lam and Captain Day, arrived at Charles's apartment, located on 4th Street in the Faubourg Liverdays, where he was hiding. Officer Day entered the apartment and attempted to approach Charles's room. In retaliation, Charles shot and killed Day. Officer Lam responded to the commotion and approached the apartment as well, only to be shot and killed by Charles as well, who'd emerged from the threshold. At this point, in response to the killing of 2 officers, the riots and violence began. There was now a manhunt for Robert Charles, consisting of predominantly white people. Between July 24th and July 27th, the rioters went about injuring innocent black bystanders in lieu of Charles. Then, on the 27th of July, when an anonymous tip provided the location of Charles on 1208 Saratoga Street, a squadron of police showed up on location in hopes of taking Charles by surprise. Shots began once more until more policemen were killed and a mob had formed around the house. It wasn't until the mob set the house on fire that the firefight stopped. When Charles fled the house, he was shot and killed. By this time, Charles had killed 27 people himself. White press coverage. In 2020, fake news is common to come across. But news media bias is also a consistent presence. Take CNN versus Fox News, for example. CNN favors the Democratic perspective and is more liberal, whereas Fox News leans more Republican. Similarly, in 1900, that same concept of bias and prejudice applied in news media. Some newspapers at the time, like the Times-Democrat and the Picayune, relayed and painted a picture of how black people were seen and should be treated through their use of language. The vocabulary is most striking. Immediately, words such as desperado, desperate, and other more unmentionable slurs are used to refer to Charles and Pierce in both papers. Phrases like will be proven burglars were also used, with suspicion, ravisher, and daredevil also cropping up. Such were ways to criminalize and dehumanize the men. Even down to the very titles of the articles, you can find things such as "A Dangerous Desperado Killed" in a Saturday issue of the Meridional in August of 1900, or "A Bad Fate" in the St. Laundry Clarion that same month. Outlets would go even so far as to fabricate the story entirely or let others do it for them. The Picayune claimed that Pierce began shooting, when Pierce never even fired. In an official statement from Officer Mora, he claimed that him and his fellow officers had approached Charles and Pierce because 3 black women had reported them. However, that was only one testimony, for in Joel Williamson's book, The Crucible of Race, he attributes an unnamed black man as having alerted Officer Alcoin to 2 suspicious-looking nearby. While both claims have some similar characteristics, it is interesting to note that the most similar between them is the claim that it was another member of the black community who summoned the police officers. While it's easy to draw some sort of conclusion based on that, perhaps the white media sought to pit the black community against itself, we can find that there's no way to be completely sure of who tipped off the police officers, or if they were tipped off at all. When it really comes down to it, it appears that there was no actual reason that these 2 men, sitting on the steps and having a conversation, were to be arrested. As Ida B. Wells puts it, both accounts attempt to fix the beginning of hostilities upon the colored men, but both were compelled to admit that the colored men were sitting on the doorsteps quietly conversing with one another when the 3 policemen went up and accosted them. Black press coverage. Though there weren't as many official black press outlets due to the suppression of black voices at the time, a lot of the news and conception of Charles by the black community happened through word of mouth. In this way, he was often seen as something of a heroic figure amongst the black community, though not by all. This was further encouraged by one of the most prominent black news sources, Ida B. Wells. In the self-distributed piece, Mob Rule in New Orleans, Robert Charles and His Fight to the Death, Wells highlights the differences between what happened versus how the white press portrayed the Charles riots, specifically targeting the Picayune and the Times-Democrat. In opposition to the white spin of the story, she covers the riots and portrays Charles and Pierce as human. Pierce and Charles aren't made out to be villains, instead definitively deemed heroic, for, quote, Charles could have died had he not raised his hand to resent unprovoked assault and unlawful arrest that fateful Monday night. That made him an outlaw, and being a man of courage, he decided to die with his face to the foe. The white people of this country may charge that he was a desperado, but to the people of his own race, Robert Charles will always be regarded as the hero of New Orleans. Wells' narration humanizes Robert Charles in a way that the white news coverage does not. She refers to him as more than just a color. In the very title of Mob Rule in New Orleans, Robert Charles and His Fight to the Death, he is not framed as a desperado or a criminal or someone to be suspicious of, but instead as a person. The way Wells divides the sections in her piece also shows the difference in how Charles is viewed. She takes the time to cover each angle, from the death of Charles, to mob brutality, to was Charles a desperado, and more. In looking at the instances where she uses his name in the titles, she is once again grounding him, making him human. Wells also used the concept of Charles being the victim here, which flips the script. Instead of criminalizing him, he becomes the one on the other end of the stick, a place where black people often weren't. In the weekly Thibodaux Sentinel, in the same month that predominantly white papers were publishing articles that called Robert Charles terrible slurs, still recognized that, defenseless, to remain at the mercy of savage white people of the southern states was something to be feared. The lynching. Despite being shot and ultimately killed, the riots didn't end there. Once Charles was dead, the mob collected his body and did what white mobs often did during the Jim Crow era. They lynched him. After being shot over 30 more times, Charles was then repeatedly stomped on and torn apart, his body thoroughly destroyed as they dragged him through the streets. The same mob, for 2 days, continued rioting, once again injuring and killing black bystanders. Entire schools, black schools, were burnt down. It wasn't until the 29th of July, when the mayor of New Orleans threatened with military retaliation, that the mob ceased their rampage. It should be noted that lynching was a painfully common practice at this time. Beginning in around the 1890s, Jim Crow laws were being enforced, laws mandating segregation amongst Black people and white people. This was the predominantly white response to the abolitionist period some years earlier, when slavery was finally outlawed in the wake of the Civil War. Now, Black Americans were forced to live under the false pretense of separate but equal. White Americans often used these laws as an excuse to treat Black Americans as inhumanly and unfairly as possible without reverting back to slavery entirely. Robert Charles was a prime example of how Black men were often interrogated for suspicious behavior, with no actual reason. Lynching and mobs were often involved as well, as was with Charles. Lynching was the practice of public hanging or otherwise murdering Black Americans in an effort to scare or punish Black citizens. Throughout the late 19th century, lynching was a severe issue, as mobs would do so without due process of law. In fact, one of the most famous reasons cited for Charles' retaliation against the police is his anger towards lynching, in particular, the lynching, burning, and dismemberment of Sam Hose in Atlanta, Georgia, just a year or so prior. Historians often note his furiousness with Hose's murder, explaining that it spurred Charles into taking a stand and refusing to back down in self-defense. Nevertheless, from 1882 to 1968, 4,743 lynchings occurred in the United States. Of these people that were lynched, 3,446 were Black. The remains of Robert Charles' body were found and buried in an unmarked grave in order to prevent further disturbance. The impact and aftermath. Though the impact and aftermath of the circumstances surrounding Charles's lynching should be cemented into history, once the dust settled and the event memorialized, he and the riots became a taboo topic. In Stephen K. Prince's article, Remembering Robert Charles, Violence and Memory in Jim Crow, New Orleans, exemplifies this by bringing up legendary jazz artist Jelly Roll Morton, who knew of a song that commemorated Robert Charles but was too dangerous to sing, the lyrics thus lost to time. Though a recording of Morton remains in which he goes over Charles and the riots, if not the lyrics. But looking even deeper into Robert Charles and what he became for many, it's again apparent that he was something of a hero for Black people who lived in the South in 1900. For decades to come, he was seen as a light in the dark for defying police brutality. Though some accounts of him have described him as rude, messy, or loud, historians believe these to be fabricated, for outright supporting him was a dangerous task. In any case, Prince describes it best. The presence of Robert Charles, an armed rebel who died in a blaze of gunfire rather than at the hands of a lynch mob, makes this particular incident distinctive. Black remembrance of the 1900 riot tended towards the celebratory, with commemoration more likely to spur resistance than prompt mourning. Thus, in many ways, Charles and the murders he committed were seen as a testament to the resistance of the Jim Crow regime. So, talking about Charles was not something that people did freely. Most had hushed conversations within their homes or in jazz clubs. In 1901, on the one-year anniversary of the riots, not one news article was written about it. And predominantly white news sources also strove to minimize the violence on their end, too, reducing the number of mob participants to hundreds rather than thousands. So though the lynching of Robert Charles has been largely brushed under the rug, it's still an event that changed history and should not be forgotten. While historians don't always have access to the most accurate accounts from people, their true feelings, or even their names, the insight gleaned from what they do find builds to something extensive. In particular, William Ivy Hare's Carnival of Fury, Robert Charles and the New Orleans Race Riots of 1900 is one of the few, if only completely comprehensive, book-length accounts of the riot. Critical discussion and the Black Lives Matter movement. Though obscured by time and ignorance, the lynching of Robert Charles and the New Orleans Race Riot isn't sealed in a vacuum. Specific characteristics, if not the entirety of the event itself, echoes into today, reverberating so strongly that it's arguably disturbing. Take the summer of 2020, in which the Black Lives Matter movement stood center on America's stage. Started in 2013 after the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation strives to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. In particular, the foundation and those aligned with it often protest against police brutality, which featured heavily in the past year. The death of George Floyd at the hands of several police officers is perhaps the most recognizable instance in which police brutality was met with protest and resistance. His final words, shared with Eric Garner, another Black man killed due to excessive use of force, were, "I can't breathe," and has since become a rallying cry for the movement. It's interesting to note that both men were unarmed at the time of their arrest and were under arrest for some kind of suspicious activity or another. Though there ought to be more differences between these two men and the lynching of Robert Charles than just the 120 years of time gone by, it appears that's not where the similarities end. Much as Floyd and Garner had been simply suspected, not accused, so too was Charles. And just as Officer Mora beat Charles about the head, so too did the officers who murdered Floyd and Garner use excessive force. The key difference, really, is that Charles was armed and Floyd and Garner were not. Yet, according to Mapping Police Violence, of the 897 people killed by the police this year, 28% have been Black, despite making up only 13% of the United States' population. It's hard to imagine that of those 251 Black men and women, not one attempted to escape the high probability of their death at the hands of an officer. Take, for instance, Dijon Kizee, a 29-year-old Black man killed by South Los Angeles police on August 31st, 2020. After having been flagged down for a traffic violation while on bicycle, Kizee discarded his bike and ran from the officers, who pursued him to a nearby avenue. When attempting to detain him, Kizee fought back, and a semi-automatic handgun dropped from his person during the struggle. Reports conflict on whether he picked up the gun or not, but either way, 19 rounds were emptied into his body by police officers. Kizee was pronounced dead on the scene. Why is it that the excessive force with which Kizee was downed is less talked about? Protests of his death arose, certainly, but his death did not court as much attention as Floyd or Garner. Is it because he fled from a minor misdemeanor? Is it because he had a gun, just as Charles had, and was unwilling to part with it upon being confronted by the police, during the same summer that so many other Black men had been killed by them? Either way, unless you take the time to follow it, Kizee's murder is just another among many, as Charles's wound up being in 1900. Without a large, flashing headline in a clear-cut right or wrong case, as was with Floyd and Garner, it appears that, no matter how much time has passed, the Black person's plight has the potential to be snuffed out. But maybe, with just a little time, a little effort, and a lot of research, the world and its historians can find a way to let stories like Kizee's and Charles breathe once again.